Hello and welcome to the new Pharma Insights podcast by Reuters Events Pharma, where we'll be having real conversations with the leaders shaping the future of pharma today. I was talking to Roland Wanderler, president of Biopharma at Grifols, one of the world's leading plasma biologics companies. Plasma-derived medicines occupy a peculiar corner of the pharmaceutical world. They cannot be synthesized in a laboratory. They depend entirely on voluntary plasma donations, and right now, roughly 2/3 of the global supply comes from a single country. We talked about what that concentration of supply means for patients everywhere and what Grifols is doing about it. We got into the Egypt story, how a public-private partnership has taken Egypt to full plasma self-sufficiency in 3 essential plasma products, and what the European Medicines Agency certification of that programme means for patients well beyond Egypt's borders. And we discussed what genuinely effective government-industry collaboration looks like in this space, and why, in a world of growing geopolitical uncertainty, plasma self-sufficiency is something governments are beginning to treat as a question of national security. Roland, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to dive in with the first question. Plasma-derived medicines are in a rather unique position because they depend entirely on donation volumes rather than manufacturing capacity, don't they? So how does that supply constraint shape Grifols' approach to market access and geographic expansion?
Yeah, and Jonathan, you're absolutely right. Despite all the advances that we had in biotechnology, today the medicines that we provide cannot be produced in the lab. They do depend on voluntary plasma donations. And so this very precious raw material is in short supply at times, and especially in a world where 65% of the global supply of plasma medicines depends on the US only. So for us to make sure that we can provide access to our medicines in a market that is growing mid to high single digit every year means that we need to think how to scale and also ensure a resilient access to the raw material, which is plasma. And so the way that we think about access, it's not about advocating for physicians to prescribe, advocating for healthcare governments to actually be able to pay for these medicines, but it starts with the raw material, the voluntary plasma donations, and partner with governments to ensure that they have the infrastructure, the regulations in place so that this raw material that many patients depend on can actually be produced at scale.
Fantastic. How has Grifols' experience operating at large-scale self-sufficient plasma system in the United States enabled the company to support other countries such as Canada and Egypt in strengthening their own plasma supply and access strategies?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the US is the leading market in sourcing plasma donations. 2/3 of the world depend on the US. But Grifols has taken the unique approach to not only source the plasma in the US and then, ship it abroad for manufacturing, bring it back. Grifols always had an in-market, for-market mindset. So what we have done in the US, and we're the only large-scale player that has done this, is combine the sourcing in our plasma donation centers with the manufacturing in the country and the commercialization to patients in that country as well. I think that end-to-end mindset is one that enabled Grifols very early on to show up as a partner at a time where governments like the Canadian one or the Egyptian one were looking for somebody to help them trace their plasma donations and therefore secure their access to these essential medicines for many patients.
Yeah, Egypt has now reached its full plasma self-sufficiency in 3 products through a public-private partnership with Grifols, and the entire value chain is now being certified by the EMA. What does this EMA validation signal in terms of quality standards, regulatory confidence, and Egypt's potential role as a regional hub?
Yeah, and let me just double-click on the first one that you said. Egypt is only the 6th country in the world that has reached self-sufficiency for its essential medicines. And you were asking, what does the EMA approval mean? Well, first of all, it's just proof of what we always knew at Grifols is that we have put state-of-the-art, high-quality plasma donation centers into Egypt, the way that we partner with the government. And, the approval of the health regulators in Europe obviously show that indeed those centers are at the highest standard. But so that's one thing. It's like a clear signal of the quality of the donation network that we are providing for Egypt. The second part, though, if you think about plasma-derived medicines. Out of the one plasma donation, we derive many different medicines. Egypt needs albumin, they need factor VIII, but immune globulins, which is another key medicine produced out of plasma, they have much less need. And so with the excess of immune globulins that come from these Egyptian plasma donations, the EMA approval allows Egypt to make that available for patients in Europe. And in Europe, you have the opposite. In Europe, you have a much higher need of immune globulins and less need for albumin and factor VIII. So the EMA approval, if you want, allows Egypt to not only know that they have top of the notch, top centers and infrastructure, but it allows them also to not only think about their own patients, but provide excess medicines to the rest of the region and actually to patients in Europe as well, and therefore lessen the dependence on the US. Because as I said before, 2/3 of the medicines are sourced from plasma today, still come from the US.
Yeah. Egypt's particularly interesting because it's a public-private partnership that's something of a model for developing a local plasma ecosystem. What does a genuinely effective, I mean, from what you've learned, what have you found out that a genuinely effective government-industry partnership looks like in this space? And what are the conditions that need to be in place to ensure these collaborations deliver real value over time?
I think a key part for a partnership like this is the understanding of a government that this needs to be a national priority. We had this in two cases now. In Canada, after the pandemic, where Canadian patients were shorted of their medicines because Canada depended 85% on the US, and after the pandemic, that access was shortened for Canada. Canada declared it a national healthcare priority to increase the self-sufficiency to 50%. If you think about Egypt, which in many ways cannot afford to source all the medicines they need out of very expensive US plasma, for them it was how to enable access locally to these medicines in an own network. But in both of these cases, when the government approached us and said we're looking for a partner, what we were able to offer is the know-how in terms of what it takes for regulations, the know-how, how you set up from a government perspective, an infrastructure, a network, an environment which allows for safe and sustainable plasma donations. And of course, then also the know-how on how to build a plasma donation center, how to collect plasma, and how to manufacture into medicines. But it all starts with the understanding of the government that this is important. And if we think about today's geopolitical context, you can imagine that for governments, self-sufficiency is increasingly important to make sure that patients that depend on these medicines can actually have these medicines.
Okay, so just in closing, outside the US and outside Canada and Egypt, what does a world with genuinely distributed plasma, self-sufficiency, actually look like? And what is Grifols' strategic role in getting there?
Yeah, at Grifols, we believe that a situation in which 2/3 of the plasma is coming from the US for, a disease area that continues to grow mid to high single digit is not the best way. And if anything, the current geopolitical context, the pandemic that we had just shows how vulnerable we are and therefore how vulnerable patients are in such a setting. So we at Grifols, we want to make sure that we can broaden this access to plasma, and self-sufficiency projects are the way to go. We're very proud of our partnership with Canadian Blood Services, very proud of our partnership with the Egyptian government, which are just two flagship programs in very different settings. Canada, a very advanced health system, Egypt, unlocking access for a population that did not have that kind of access before. But what we hear across the world is that there's more and more interest from governments just to see for, similar to rare minerals, if you want, how can you ensure that you have as a country access to these medicines that your patients, your citizens actually need? And for us, a world in which more regions have access to plasma from the market, in the market, for the market, the better a world it will be and the more patients will be able to benefit.
Absolutely. Fascinating. Roland Wanderlow at Grifols, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure to be here.
Roland Wanderlow, President of Biopharma at Grifols there. And a reminder that some of the most essential medicines in existence cannot be made in a laboratory. 2/3 of the global supply comes from a single country. That's a vulnerability, and changing it is what Grifols has made its business. That's it for this edition of Reuters Events Pharma Insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss our next conversation with another outstanding leader from across the pharmaceutical and health science world. We're on all the usual platforms. Join us for the next edition of the podcast, where I'll be talking to Mark Dooman, founder of patient advocacy organisation Illuminate. Mark has spent more than 30 years making the case for patients inside the pharmaceutical industry, and he has a lot to say about why, despite all the good intentions, patient engagement remains more often the work of individual champions than a structural priority. We'll be asking what it would take to build a single industry-wide picture of every stage in the drug life cycle where patients should have a voice, and whether, in the end, it'll take regulation rather than goodwill alone to make it happen. Until then, goodbye.